Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will cover the influence of training frequency on muscle growth. First and foremost, we need to establish what frequency means. Training frequency essentially refers to how frequent a muscle is trained. This is usually quantified as the number of times a muscle is trained per week, since most people follow the same training split each week. Therefore, for the remainder of this video, we will refer to frequency as the number of times a muscle is trained per week. When discussing frequency, we also need to clarify a major caveat. When comparing different training frequencies, we are assuming that volume is equated. More specifically, the total number of sets are the same between conditions. This is because it is quite clear that volume has a significant influence on muscle growth, so changes in volume as a result of changes in frequency will likely influence hypertrophy outcomes. Therefore, for the remainder of this video, we will refer to frequency with the assumption that total number of sets per week are equated. When discussing frequency, we generally refer to how many times we directly train a specific muscle group. However, it is often the case that muscles can be trained indirectly through exercises which the muscle is not a prime mover. The muscle will not be stressed to the same extent as when it is trained directly, but it may still receive a slight hypertrophy stimulus. While this is not really an important factor, it should just be understood that frequency is not a black and white topic, it has some nuance about it. However, for this video, frequency will only refer to direct training for each muscle group. So the real question is, how does frequency influence muscle growth? Luckily, we have several studies investigating the influence of frequency on muscle growth. The latest meta-analysis on this topic concluded that training frequency had no significant influence on muscle growth. However, this was under the condition that volume, as calculated by number of sets per muscle group, was equated between frequencies. So if the same total amount of weekly volume is performed, it doesn't seem to make much difference how many times this is distributed throughout the week. For example, let's look at these two training frequencies. We can see that the first involves 6 sets of training for a certain muscle group twice per week, while the second trains the same muscle group 3 times per week with 4 sets in each session. Both training splits have a total of 12 weekly sets for this muscle group across the entire week. Both routines are therefore likely to result in similar muscle growth because total weekly volume is equated. However, the analysis did find that training a muscle once per week was slightly inferior to training with a higher frequency. Therefore, it may be slightly superior to train a muscle more than once per week. This research review came to a similar conclusion, finding no significant effect of frequency on muscle growth when volume was equated. However, the researchers did suggest that there may be a slight benefit to training more than once per week, even under volume equated conditions. So now we understand that frequency doesn't have much of an impact on muscle growth when volume is equated. However, frequency may have an indirect influence on muscle growth via its impact on other training variables. Let's now cover how frequency may indirectly influence hypertrophy. The first influence frequency may have is on volume. As established, frequency has no significant influence on muscle growth when volume is equated. However, frequency may be a strategy to manipulate how much volume is accumulated for a specific muscle group. Since we know that volume does seem to have a significant influence on hypertrophy, frequency may be manipulated with the goal of accumulating more volume. Training with a higher frequency is an easy way to increase total weekly volume, while training with a lower frequency will reduce the opportunity to accumulate volume. This indirect influence of frequency can be seen in this study. Trainees performed a full body resistance program 1, 2, or 3 times per week. Naturally, the higher frequency resulted in more total volume to be performed per week. As a result, a higher frequency resulted in greater gains in lean mass compared with training once per week. As a more relevant example, let's say a trainee performs 12 sets of chest training once per week. They may perform 3 sets of bench press, 3 sets of incline dumbbell press, 3 sets of dips, and 3 sets of cable flies. It would be difficult to perform more high quality chest volume on this day because the muscle will be quite fatigued. However, if the trainee splits this volume across 2 days per week rather than 1, they now only need to perform 6 total sets in each session to accumulate the same total number of sets. Because the chest is now not going to be as fatigued by the end of the session, the trainee may be able to increase volume and maintain a high quality of training. In this case, the trainee may decide to perform 7 sets on each day rather than 6, which equates to a total of 14 weekly sets for the chest. As we can see, the higher frequency made it slightly more practical for the trainee to increase total training volume. Another indirect influence that frequency can have on muscle growth is on training performance. This refers to the weight used and the repetitions performed each set. Generally, longer rest periods seem to result in greater muscle growth. This is likely due to a greater acute dissipation of fatigue, allowing performance to be greater with subsequent sets. This results in greater mechanical tension per set, which may explain why greater hypertrophy outcomes are observed. The same phenomenon is likely to occur when training with different frequencies. When frequency is higher, less total volume is performed per session. This allows less acute fatigue per set and performance to be greater. This may provide a slightly more hypertrophic stimulus compared with a lower frequency where performance may be inhibited. This phenomenon can be seen in this study, comparing a volume-matched full-body training routine, training each muscle group once versus twice per week. Although the total number of sets was equated between groups, we can see a disparity in total workload each week. The group training twice per week had a higher total overall weekly tonnage compared with the group training once per week. In other words, trainees were able to lift more weight or perform more repetitions on average when frequency was higher. As a result, the group training twice per week saw slightly greater hypertrophy for most muscle groups. This phenomenon may also explain the results seen in the previously discussed meta-analysis. Even when volume is equated, training with a higher frequency seems to result in slightly greater muscle growth than training a muscle once per week. This may be due to greater lifting performance per set when using a higher frequency. And the last indirect influence frequency may have on muscle growth is through injury risk. As discussed, a higher training frequency generally allows superior lifting performance. Although this may be slightly more hypertrophic, it may theoretically be more injurious too. This is because using heavier loads induces greater stress on the joints and connective tissue. In opposition, a lower frequency will limit average loads lifted in the session and may allow the trainee to take each set close to failure without having to induce as much joint stress. This is an entire theoretical concept, but it is certainly a factor to consider. So what practical recommendations can we conclude from all of this information? Well, it seems that frequency doesn't seem to have much influence on muscle growth when total weekly volume is equated. Rather, frequency is a way of distributing total weekly volume across the week. However, frequency may have indirect influences on hypertrophy via its effects on other variables. Most notably, frequency can be an effective method to increase training volume if desired. Since volume has a significant positive effect on muscle growth, a higher frequency may be a strategy to help accumulate more total sets for a specific muscle group. Furthermore, a higher frequency may be slightly superior than a lower frequency, as it allows trainees to maintain a high level of performance throughout the session. However, a higher frequency may also increase injury risk for the same reason. Therefore, trainees should try to hit each muscle group directly at least twice per week. A frequency of 2 or more times per week is likely to make little difference on hypertrophy outcomes, so trainees can self-select a frequency that they prefer. This selection should be balanced between a frequency that allows trainees to maintain a high level of performance and that which allows a maintenance of joint and connective tissue health. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.